Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to our CF live session on transplants and cystic fibrosis. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Becky Kilgareth, and I'm one of the joint heads of information support and programs at the Trust, and I'm going to be facilitating this session. So the aim of the session tonight is to give you information about transplant. We're aiming this session at people on or on the transplant list or approaching the transplant list, and we hope it will be a really helpful session for you. We've got some brilliant speakers, so I'm just going to quickly introduce you to them one by one. Speakers, if you could just pop your camera on while you say hello. So Andrew first.
Hello there. Yes, I'm Andrew Watson. I've got cystic fibrosis, which was diagnosed at birth, and I had a double lung transplant in May 2017 at the age of 48.
Thanks, Andrew. And Tom?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Becky. So I'm Tom Daniels, Dr. Tom Daniels, and I'm a respiratory and cystic fibrosis consultant looking after adults in Southampton and helping in the Wessex Adult Cystic Fibrosis Service. And I have a particular interest and expertise in referral and management of people with CF thinking about lung transplantation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jess? Oh, Jess, you're on mute.
That's an excellent start, isn't it? I was bound to be the one to do that. I'm Jessica Jones, and I'm the Policy and Public Affairs Officer at the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, with a specialism in transplant policy.
Great, thank you. So just a few housekeeping things. We are recording this session, and we usually make the sessions available to watch online afterwards. For that reason, we ask you all to have your cameras off and to be on mute, other than each speaker when they're speaking. We are monitoring the chat box, so do feel free to add comments and questions there, and we have specific points in the agenda where we're going to try and pick up some of those questions. Also, thank you to those of you who sent in questions ahead of time. We've got some preset questions for today and also can pick things up in the chat, but I just wanted to mention that as much as possible, we've been guided by people with CF who are either post-transplant or on the transplant journey in terms of the questions that we're asking. It is a sensitive topic that we're talking about tonight. I know it can be emotional for some people. We are going to just pop some signposts in the chat now, just places you can go if you come away from today's session just feeling that you immediately kind of need somebody to talk to. Those services are there. Our helpline will also be back open tomorrow 10 till 4. So other than that, I think we'll head on to our speakers. So just to give you a flavour of what we're going to cover tonight, we have Andrew's with us, who's going to share his personal experience and then pick up some questions. And Tom's then going to pick up some more of the questions that have been provided in advance, and we'll try and for both of them fit in questions that come in through the chat as well. And then Jess is going to give a summary of the Cystic Fibrosis Trust's policy work in the area of transplants. So I shall first pass on. Oh yes, we also have some polls to run. So we'll be running a few polls throughout the evening. So firstly, we're going to ask you to tell us who you are in terms of who the audience is, because that's really useful for us. So if you could tick whichever of these boxes you feel you best fit into, that would be really helpful. And it's really useful for us. We did ask when people booked on who they were, but it's really helpful for us to also see who is here tonight. Thank you, that's great. Can we share the responses to that? Ah, brilliant. Okay, so we've got a mixture of people here tonight, people with CF both pre and post-transplant, and parents and carers and relatives, CF professionals and staff members. So a good mix of people. We're going to ask you one more question now via the polls, which helps us to understand your level of understanding and knowledge And we also ask this something similar at the end because it helps us to understand the difference that these sort of sessions make for you. So before joining the event, how confident do you feel making informed decisions when thinking about the transplant process? Please tick whichever box you feel most comfortable with there. Great. Can we have a look at the results? Okay. So a mix, but probably towards the not so confident end of the scale. Okay. Great. Well, thank you all for participating. That's really helpful. Okay. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Andrew. So Andrew, if you could pop your camera on and unmute. So I'll hand over to you. Andrew's going to spend about 15 minutes telling you his personal experience of transplant, and then we'll pick up some questions. So if you do think of questions while Andrew's talking, please feel free to put them in the chat because we're keeping an eye on it. Andrew, over to you.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Becky, for that introduction. And also thanks to the CF Trust for putting on this event and inviting me to speak. I'm very passionate about my own transplant experience, and I really like talking about it. As having had one quite literally has changed my life and arguably saved my life, so it's been massive for me. I've even written a blog about my story too. So it's something of a miracle, really, from struggling and being on oxygen 24 hours a day to now living life like a 20-something. Well, probably not quite, but not far off it, according to as I've been told. But I'm very conscious that no two people with CF or those who've had a transplant are the same. Everyone has their own stories, their own issues, and mine is just one of those stories. Some are luckier than others, and that's I guess that's the way it is. I've always approached living life with CF as positively as I could, and I'm hugely positive about the whole transplant experience. And hopefully what you'll hear this evening will help some of you listening to understand more about the whole process and perhaps dispel some fear. As Becky said, I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, after which Becky will have some further questions for me from, I guess, from what you may have all, questions you may have asked during the next 15 minutes. But I've approached this speech really in 4 parts. First part about in advance, i.e. pre-transplant. Secondly, about the time I was on the list. Thirdly, the day of the transplant itself. And fourthly, post-transplant. And my thoughts are really on an emotional perspective rather than a clinical basis. It's more my thoughts as a patient, as someone with CF, like many of you watching, or even parents of those who are contemplating transplants watching. So let's look at the first part, pre-transplant. I mean, the thought of a transplant. I mean, what do you think? There's fear, there's nervousness, you're scared. It's a natural human emotion. Do I want a transplant? How long can I wait before I have a transplant? What's the chance of success? And also, how long will I live if I don't have one or if I do have one? These are those questions that you all want to know pre-transplant, and you ask the doctors, but to be honest, they don't know. And as I said earlier, no two people are the same. So we just have to sort of work our way through it as best we can based on medical evidence and our own emotion as well. So like most of you with CF watching and your family, these are huge questions, sometimes too big to even consider, a sort of an elephant in the room, perhaps you might say. I mean, like many of you, I used to go to clinic, I'd have my lung function tests, and I was a bit of a wreck really. I was thinking, God, if these tests are low, what would happen? What would the doctor say to me? Would I need a transplant? Sort of the dreaded question, go on a transplant list. However, for me, ultimately, it was an easy decision. And this is the sad bit of the tragic bit of my story, really, is that I had a younger brother, Nick, who was almost 4 years younger than me. And when I was 33 and Nick was 29, he died of CF. His health was worse than me, but it was a huge surprise to us at the time. We never thought this would happen. He'd just got on the transplant list, but only just, and it was all too late for him. So as you can imagine, this is a tragic loss to all the family, his wife, mum and dad, my sister. And we still think about him every day, sort of 20 years on. It's difficult. I mean, that's part of my story. I mean, a lot of you will have known people with CF who've died, and I think what it did to me really, it told me that at some point in my life I would have to go on the transplant list. Clearly, I'll be guided by the doctors and the medics, But really the real thing was not to leave it too late, and that's what I drew from this. But even knowing that, I was still nervous and scared as anybody else would be, with this huge unknown ahead of me. So at some point, the doctors will suggest to those of you with CF that you might consider, or you might be suitable for a transplant. And if you are, you'll go to an assessment centre. For me, I was a patient at Brompton, so I went to Harefield for my assessment. It's 2 or 3 days of tests, all sorts of tests, chats with doctors and nurses. And I would say that's not to be feared. I mean, it's hugely beneficial in the whole process because you learn so much, even if it could be said it's a little daunting. The hard part is obviously waiting for the decision as to whether you might be suitable for a transplant, which can be agonising. I think I waited 2 or 3 weeks from memory. You know, if you get a letter that says you're suitable, well, that's great. But if you don't, then obviously that's pretty hard. The other piece of advice I would give those of you considering having a transplant is to ask to speak to somebody who's had one before. When at Brompton, I asked the doctors, and they put me in touch with a lady who's a couple of years older than me, who's willing to talk about her experiences. And that was really beneficial to me. I found it hugely helpful because I could ask all the questions that you can't necessarily ask the doctors or the nurses. It's just the questions that you as a fellow patient might be considering. And this particular lady, she was a school teacher. She was in a wheelchair. She did the best she could, but post-transplant, she was able to sort of go out for walks and run around, and it was like, wow, that's amazing. So that filled me with great confidence in advance. If you are able to do that, I would say it's a big positive. So you're on the list. You've decided the medical team. You're on the list. What happens next? So I suppose I've got a few practical tips here, which I found really quite helpful. One was to have a separate phone. So I've just bought a pay-as-you-go, for 10 or something like that. Took it everywhere with me, but the only person who knew that number was the Harefield transplant team. So if you use your own phone, every time it rings, you'd be, God, is that the call? Whereas I had this one small phone, took it with me everywhere. So I think that's absolutely essential. The second point, and this sounds quite hard, but you have to sort out your finances, your will, your funeral arrangements, but it has to be done. It gives you peace of mind, and I would just say it's a positive. It's just one of those things you have to do. Thirdly, you've obviously got to pack your bag, usual sort of stuff, but bring also your exercise gear and your trainers with you, because if you have the transplant, all of a sudden they want to get you going straight away. So you know that's quite important. The next point is contacts. Now, I found this hugely helpful. To have someone in charge of telling your friends and your family where you are in the process, i.e. if you get the call, what's happening post-transplant. And I think that should be a partner or a parent or a close family member, because you as a patient, you'll be too busy. You need to focus on yourself. You know, I know we're all on our phone all the time these days, but in this situation, it's just not the thing to do. And what we did, we created a series of email groups, you know, one for work, one for family, and it would just disseminate. You would have somebody who's head of each group, so they would get in my case, the note from my wife. She would contact various people saying this is where we are, and they would then, like the guy at work would then spread the word to other people. So you created subgroups. I think these days you probably just use WhatsApp groups. I think some we've done a bit, so you'd have various WhatsApp groups. And then you as a patient, you just don't have to worry about that. And it might sound a silly thing to say, but post-transplant, or let's say the whole process, when you've actually got the call, you can't be bothering with that. Whereas everyone else is desperate to know. I mean, people just want to know, you know, what's happening in your life, particularly your family. You know, my parents, we told them in the morning, and what do they do for the rest of the day? They just need to be kept up to date. And fifthly, it's a work setup. If you're still working at a transplant, you need to have everything arranged. So then we have the great waits. So you're all ready, and this waiting game for the transplant can vary. How long are you going to wait? Some wait for years, some wait for a very short time. Now, for me, it was 18 months from getting on the list to having a transplant. For me, I became quite unwell 15 months into the whole process. I was admitted to Brompton. There was a bit of an emergency, and I then just stayed at the Brompton until I got the call. So I was elevated up the list. But so I think I was at Brompton for 10 weeks before the call came, so I was very lucky in that regard. But you could be waiting for ages. So let's move on to the day itself. I can obviously only comment on my own experiences, but I was clearly very lucky in that the day I got the call was the day I had the transplant. Now, I've heard stories of others who've been called in like 10 or 11 times over the period of a 4-year period before getting the transplant. So, I mean, how deflating and agonizing is that? You get called in, and then you wait around, and you get told, terribly sorry, it's not, the match isn't quite right. So I think you have to have an expectation that this may not happen on the day. You just have to prepare yourself for that, because otherwise it can be really hard work. For me, as I say, I was at the Brompton. Rather ironically, the nurse came in at 7 o'clock in the morning, said to me, right, Andrew, you're going to be getting you're going to be getting a call. You might get a phone call fairly shortly. So I thought, oh, what's this then? And this tiny little phone that I'd had, it rang at some point. And would you believe, I had IVs on, and I just couldn't get them in time. The thing rang off, which was all a bit amusing. But I think it's where I was in the Brompton. Obviously, but they rang again, and the nurses knew. So then it was an ambulance to Harefield. Quite a strange experience, it must be said. Driving through London with the flashing lights on and people all the way to Harefield. And for me, obviously, there's various centres around the country. Harefield was the one I was linked to the Brompton, which is where I went. It was all quite relaxed when we got there. There was no major rush. We had bloods taken, and it was a waiting game. Will the lungs they've identified for me be good enough for me? So it took a while. We were there all day really, until 5 o'clock. So I've been there for 8 hours roughly. The transplant coordinator came in and he said, right, Andrew, it's all good news, all good news. We're going to prepare the chariot to collect me. Wow, how about that? The chariot. What I love that expression. It's like something very special was coming to take me on to this big event. So we got prepared, had a shower. I had to have my chest shaved. I got a slightly hairy chest, so they had this little lady, the Italian lady, was trying to shave my chest, which added to it broke the ice a little bit, I guess. And then 2 or 3 hours later, I think it was, the chariot arrived. I was all ready, and the chariot arrived to take me off for my big event. So off we went. The transplant coordinator, my wife, we went to an ante room at Harefield, and this was all a little bit surreal because the room at Harefield prior to transplant is a very calm room. There's floral images on the wall, gently moving, just floating. There was music on of birds twittering away, and it was all quite nice. It was all quite calm to get me ready for this big event. Then I was called through, said goodbye to my wife, and this was it. This was it. The big moment had arrived, and understandably, I was a little bit nervous, as you would be, which the transplant coordinator detected. So she held my hand and keep me calm at this big moment. I was wheeled through into the room where loads of people, as far as I could tell, all ready for me. I was moved from this chariot onto another bed, and I lay there. The anaesthetic was injected, and the last thing I can recall was looking up. Just up there was a clock, and it was just turned 8 o'clock, and I was gone. That was it. Then my eyes opened. Blimey, I thought, I'm still alive. I've made it through. I looked around me. There's wires, tubes everywhere. But I'm still here. It's worked. So I was in my own room in intensive care. There were 2 nurses in the room. And I asked the time. What time is it? It's perhaps a strange thing to ask, but it was 4 a.m. 4 a.m. I thought, well, 8 hours. But it wasn't really. It was 4 a.m. But it was the following day. A day later, I'd missed a day. I'd missed a day of my life. It'd gone. The operation had taken 8 hours, but it kept me asleep for another 24 hours. Just to ensure that everything was fine and the new lungs started to fit. So yeah, it was amazing experience. So let's move on to the 4th part, post-transplant. So I've stayed in the intensive care unit for a few days before moving to other wards, different wards at Harefield, depending on how soon after transplant it is, and how well how well it's all gone. I was told this has all gone pretty well. And then it's on this case of rehab. I know somebody's asked a question about what rehab you have in hospital. The doctors were really keen to get me moving as soon as possible, get these new lungs working. You know, you've got them in, they want them to work straight away. So within no time at all, they got me out of the bed. They got me on an exercise bike, which sounds a bit bizarre, but you've got these big drains that are coming out of your lungs. You've got wires everywhere, you know, out of your neck, out of your wrist and whatnot, which has to be done. It's a major operation, but they're very keen. Let's just get you on this bike. Let's just get you pedaling a little bit, get the heart moving and working. And as soon as I was in there, I did more bike cycling, walking through the wards, walking up and down corridors, up some steps and down steps, and also had a massage as well, just to try and get your body used to its new situation, because it's had a huge change to it, so it needs to get flexible and working again as soon as possible. So how long was I there for? Well, as I know questions have been asked, it was 3 weeks before me going home, and as I say, the doctors wanted me to get back to normal life as soon as possible. So initially I was back to, after that, once I was home, I was back to Harefield every couple of days for bloods and for monitoring, and then it went longer, 4 days, then weekly. And so you're back home, here you are, you've got these new lungs, what are you going to do? So the first 2 months I was told to just stay at home, avoid crowded places, don't go to shops, don't go to pubs, don't go to restaurants, because we're still very vulnerable, still at risk of these new lungs not working. And certainly avoiding any types of getting infection from anybody. So I stayed at home with trips to the hospital, exercised as much as possible. I'm walking around locally. I had a bike at home, so I could go on that. Albeit I couldn't drive initially, so I was completely reliant on friends or family to take me to Harefield, and just really get comfortable with the new lungs. But the most thing, it was just amazing. I mean, it was just incredible. Lung function from being 20% of predicted to initially just kept rising and rising. I think it was about 60 or 70% post-transplant. Within a year, it was over 100%. Saturation levels from being sort of early 90s and late 80s, going down to 70s with an exercise. Now it was up at 98, 99. It was amazing. It was an incredible feeling. For all of those of you out there with CF, looking at your own lung function results and your own saturation levels, you think, God, really? Is that possible? Is that really possible? And the answer is yes, it is possible. I know it's not like that for everybody. I'm very aware of that how lucky I've been. But you know, it can just revolutionise your life. You just won't be able to believe it. Well, I can now run 10K. I played a load of golf. It's just incredible. I was back to work within 6 months, initially 3 days a week. And so it's been marvellous. So for me, transplants, in a bit of a summary, an incredible experience, really. I mean, it's a miracle. It quite frankly is. And I'll be forever grateful, not only to the donor and the donor's family, but also to all the staff at both Brompton and Harefield. It's quite amazing. It's been an incredible experience. And there we go. That's my story.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you for sharing so openly with us. I've got a couple of questions that have come in advance. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll pick them up if we can. So firstly, this is a really interesting question that came in advance. Can you describe one feeling or sensation that you had post-transplant that you hadn't anticipated?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. And I would say there's two. There's two slight negatives, and obviously the positive one obviously is. So the negatives, I say negatives, or slightly unusual ones, were immediately post-transplant, my eyes were quite blurred. So I couldn't actually, so when I did get my phone, I couldn't really read it. It was just it was impossible to read. So it took about 3 or 4 days, really, before I could see properly. I could see distance-wise, but anything close up, it was just very blurred, which bit bizarre. The other thing, my calves, really quite painful. Initially walking outside, it wasn't too bad, but if I walked a bit quicker, I could really feel the bottom of my calves, excruciating pain. And if I went running, it was just horrendous. So I mean, that's taken a little while. That took a little bit of a while, but I mean, I suppose I hadn't been running for a long time, so you could say that was the reason. Yeah, that was a bit unusual. But I mean, whether anyone else has had that experience, I don't know. But they were the two unusual feelings. But the overwhelming positive feeling is that I could breathe. You know, I could breathe properly again, and that was the. I mean, I suppose pre-transplant, you don't quite appreciate you know what can happen, but to be able to breathe and run and not even think about breathing, it's just incredible. I mean, that was the yes, that was my answers to that question.
Thank you. Another question that came in advance was, were you given any practical advice about things like what you should or shouldn't eat after transplant, any activities you needed to avoid, anything like that?
Yes, that's quite a funny one as well. As to what to eat, I suppose in a nutshell, you would say eat like a pregnant person, to be quite frank. So basically, no soft cheese, no raw meats, no shellfish, so no crabs, no prawns, no hummus, no Seville oranges. So whether that means just oranges from Seville, I don't know. But to be quite frank, though, in the overall scheme of things, it's all minor. You know, if you can't have shellfish, so what? You know, it's a small price to pay. Drink is something I raised after transplant. Could I drink alcohol after? You know, obviously that sort of thing. You don't bother about that. But you know, as time goes on, yeah, they were quite relaxed about it. Just be sensible. Travel again, quite relaxed again. Not initially, but I was told, look, you know, just be sensible. There's no hard and fast rules. Don't wrap yourself in cotton wool. Was the sort of the overall feeling. You know, you've got these new lungs. Get out there and enjoy them and live life, you know, like you couldn't do before. Obviously, with COVID, things have changed slightly, clearly, but the overall feeling was, you've got these new lungs, make the most of them, really. And activity-wise, well, you're not going to do anything that's going to impact on your lungs initially. But to be quite frank, they said, you know, within 6 to 9 months, your lungs should be well embedded, and there's no reason why you can't play football or whatever it might be. So it's very much a case of you've got this new chance and make the most of it. Really, was the overriding feeling.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to pick up one from the chat. I know there's one about capture, but I think we'll pick that up later through a question that we've got for Tom anyway. What is the biggest difference for you between pre and post transplant life?
The biggest difference, it's being able to just live life without feeling inhibited. Like pre-transplant, how am I going to get there? If I get there with my oxygen, where we're going to park, or if I need to go up steps, oh gosh, how many steps are there going to be? You know, it was all about, you were constantly inhibited. You know, you took oxygen wherever I went. Would the oxygen last long enough? It was a whole, you know, the steps. You know, you'd be out of breath all the time. Whenever I go anywhere, go up steps, I'd have to stop, and people would ask me, "Are you okay? You okay? You fine?" Or I say, "Yeah, I'm fine." But you know, no, you just have to. Everything took twice as long. Getting dressed took a long time. Everything took a long time. And now, there's no. So it's as though the reins are off. I can just do what I like. You know. That's the. But not be blasé about it. Sometimes you sort of forget a little bit. You've had this great new opportunity in life, but I guess that's what they want to happen. That you've had this amazing experience, and make the most of it and enjoy it. That was the main thing. No inhibition.
Marvelous, thank you. And just remind us, because I did see there's a question about this. How many years ago was your transplant?
Yeah, it was 4.5 years ago. So I had it when I was 48. So it was May 2017, and I'm 53 now. So long may these lungs last.
Marvelous. I know the person who's commented just said they're 25 years post-transplant.
Wow, brilliant. Well, that's amazing. So that's huge. I mean, just think about all of those of us who've had transplant. If we could all, we're not over will last 25 years, but we'll all last different lengths of time. But that's such a positive thing to know that somebody on the call here has 25 years post-transplant. So well played. Well played you. That's great.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So I know, as well as being a brilliant speaker, you're also a brilliant writer. And right at the end, we'll share the link to Andrew's blog for those of you who want to read a bit more. There it is. The link's there. Okay. Thank you, Andrew. I'll ask you to camera off and mute.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Becky.
Tom, can we come to you?
Yeah.
Great.
Here.
So So I'm going to effectively interview you, Tom, with some questions that have been pre-prepared, but also happy to pick up things that come in through the comments as well, as much as we can.
Sure.
So my team at the Cystic Fibrosis Trust work on the helpline. So I wanted to pick up a couple of the things that come in to us regularly through the helpline about transplant. So firstly, we sometimes hear from people who have questions about when is the right time to be referred for a transplant assessment. At what point does the CF team decide to talk to somebody about referral? That's certainly something that we hear quite a bit. I wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Becky. So it's a really difficult thing to think about and to get right. And I guess there isn't a one size fits all answer, but the general principles that I try and work towards are that I try and talk about lung transplant frequently. I try and sort of normalize the conversation, because I see it as, like Andrew does, I see it as a really transformative and hopeful and amazing treatment when it's done at the right time and in the right way. So I try and have conversations with my patients regularly, just to sort of, make sure that they've heard of it, and that I can sort of try and address any sort of misconceptions they may have. In terms of getting the timing right, there are two ways it can be the wrong timing. The one is too early, and the other is too late. And too late, as we've heard Andrew and his, unfortunately, his brother, too late is really is a disastrous way to get it wrong. Too early, I don't see that as a bad thing. So, because all it means is that someone knows a bit more about the transplant process and they've had a bit longer to get used to the idea, and it means they're definitely not going to be too late. So my preference, and this is backed up by international guidelines, is to talk about it early, and it's really never too early to be referred. Some CF doctors may may advise you, and you may come to a decision yourself, that it's maybe is a bit early at the moment. We can afford to wait a bit longer. But I think as long as those conversations have started, then that's the most important thing. And it's important that people don't see it as any sort of failure or something to be frightened of, but much more as a treatment option, which very often, although realistically not always, but very often is the transformative procedure and transformative treatment that we've heard about from Andrew and someone else who's now 25 years post-transplant. So yeah, that's how I'd try and talk to my patients about it.
Thank you. One of the things that I've noticed working on the helpline is when people talk to us about them or their family member being referred for transplant, some people feel that's really a positive thing, a really important step forward in their CF treatment, and for others it's a really frightening thing, and they can feel that that's quite kind of devastating news, that it's a last resort, and perhaps that they fear that the outcomes aren't good. What would you say to people who sort of have that reaction?
So there's a whole bit of information around statistics and numbers that is worth mentioning, and I'll mention it, but it doesn't feel very personal when we talk about sort of averages and numbers and things like that. But I think it's worth saying, because we've heard about Andrew's amazing experience and other people who've had good experiences, and yet if you look at social media, or you talk to friends, sometimes you will find people who haven't done so well and haven't had such a good experience. And the only way of sort of getting a truer picture between those two opposite extremes is to look at averages. So currently, the average time that someone would usually live for after a transplant with CF is somewhere between about 10, 11 years, something like that. So that's half of people living less than that, half of people living more than that. Remembering, of course, that bit of information is based on the last 20 years of transplantation, and every year things have got slightly better, just like they have with CF care, although they've got dramatically better in the last 2 years. They've got slightly better every year. So one could follow that increasing curve and make predictions beyond that. That would be even better. But on average, that's what the data is telling us at the moment. But I certainly wouldn't, and I wouldn't see being referred for transplant as devastating. The other thing that can be difficult to talk about, and sometimes is a reason why it can seem devastating, is that being referred and considering a lung transplant needs to be put in context of what the alternative is. And although having a transplant and that operation seems scary, and it is scary, it's a big operation, it's a risky thing to have, it needs to be put in context of what the alternative is, and the alternative is not having a transplant. And it's important to have open and honest conversations about what that particular path, not having a transplant, might look like. We're not very good at making predictions around those things, but if you talk to your team and talk to other people with knowledge of CF and outcomes, you can usually get some sort of flavor of what that path is going to look like. And sometimes it's difficult to talk about, but the future is still there, even if you don't want to look at it. So I think it's only really, it is most scary when one is not considering the alternatives, I think is what I would say. And therefore, because of that, it should be seen much more as a hopeful, exciting, and transformative procedure. So, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, coming on to some slightly more kind of practical questions that have come in. Can someone with CF choose which transplant centre they're referred to?
So the theoretical answer to that is yes. You can be referred to any of the 5 lung transplant centres in the UK. But for most people, the practicalities of being referred to anywhere but their nearest centre override that sort of possibility. There are only 5 of them, and not many people, it's not on the doorstep of many people in the UK. For a few people, there are other considerations that might come into play. So, for example, only certain centres are transplanting both lungs and liver. Hayfield is not one of those, but Patworth will do both. Birmingham will do both. Not sure about Newcastle. So some people that will need both, and so that's a consideration. But for most people, yes, in theory, they can ask to be referred to the centre of their choice. They can be asked to be referred to the centre of their choice. But for most people, the choice will be limited by geography.
Thanks. And just picking up on something that's just in the chat, I don't know if this is something you have access to the data on, but somebody's asked which of those 5 transplant centres has the highest success rate. Is there data available on that?
Yeah, there's loads of data available on that. You can search it up and find it. The cardiothoracic registry run by the Royal College of Surgeons publishes data. I think they may have handed that job on to NHS Blood and Transplant more recently. And there are many ways to slice and dice the data, and basically they're all pretty good. In general, the centres that do more transplants have better outcomes, and that's true of most things in medicine. So that's why bigger CF centres seem to have better results than perhaps some smaller CF centres. And that's certainly true of surgical procedures like lung transplantation. And the bigger centres are Hayfield, Patworth and Newcastle. Birmingham and Manchester are slightly smaller. But each has got their own sort of advantages and disadvantages. But in general, there is that data out there, but the bigger centres tend to do better.
Thank you. And if we can, during the course of the call, if we identify any good links, we'll pop them in the chat for people to be able to access. Another question that's come in advance is, does the transplant list have an order of priority?
Sort of, yes. There's sort of 3 categories, technical categories: super urgent, urgent, and everyone else. And super urgent is really people who are, for example, needing intensive support on intensive care, something called ECMO. People on the urgent list, there are some very strict criteria around oxygen levels, need for non-invasive ventilation, coughing up blood, those sorts of things. Very strict criteria to get onto those lists. And then within the rest, it's a matter of the transplant team matching the organs that have become available to the people for whom they're suitable, based on blood type, which is important, based on size, which is quite important, and also based on what they know about the severity and how sick that person is. So, so yes, there is a sort of a prioritization process, but there is also a sort of matching process going on at the same time.
Okay, thank you. And thinking about post-transplant, what does transplant aftercare involve? And do people who are post-transplant, are they still receiving care from their CF team, or does their transplant team become their main point of contact?
Yeah, so this is a bit more a bit trickier, really. There isn't a straightforward answer to that. Most people who've had a transplant remain under the care of the transplant centre in their entirety for all their care for about the first year, and then after a year or so, some of their some of their that's going to log me out. Some of their care will start to be transferred back to the CF centre. So I'm aware that some people with CF and some CF physicians feel that the clarity of what care is provided where is sometimes leaves something to be desired. And I'm also aware that NHS England is aware of that, and it's something that they're looking at the moment. So I think it's quite difficult, actually, because most people with CF, as they get older and often therefore get sicker and closer to needing a transplant, most people with CF develop quite strong bonds with their CF team. You know, they know the doctors very well and have known them for years, and the nurses and the physios and the dietitians. And as one gets sicker and closer to transplant, those bonds get stronger because you're seeing more of those people. And then at the time of transplant, suddenly all your care moves to a completely different team, and that can be both difficult on a practical level, particularly if the new team is much further away from your home, but also on an emotional level, whereby suddenly you know how the CF team works, and you know who to talk to, and you know how to access it. Suddenly it's all up in the air, and you've got to get to know a whole new team and a whole new different way of working with a whole new condition, effectively, new medicines. And that can be very challenging, very tricky. We're sort of starting to understand that that's a sort of second transition process. The first transition process being from CF children's to CF adults, and then a second transition process from CF adults into post-transplant care. And again, it's something that we're working on, but I think currently is still work in progress.
Thanks. So that's really interesting to think of it as a sort of second transition. I guess I just wanted to add at this point that all of our Cystic Fibrosis Trust support services are available to people post-transplant, just as they are to anybody with CF. And I think one of the main kind of areas where that becomes relevant is benefits advice. So we have a specialist welfare benefits advisor, and I know often people are able to access social worker support through their CF team, but if they're not, I know that's one of the questions that people often have post-transplant is, does my entitlement to benefit change? When does it change? When do I tell them? So just to reassure anybody listening that you won't have a gap in that support, because you can always come to us. Okay, so the last sort of planned question we have is about the future of transplant and how that interacts with the arrival of modulated therapies like Orkambi and Symkevi and Kaftrio and Kalydeco. I just wondered first, Tom, if you could pick up on the question that had come in for Andrew about whether people post-transplant are on or eligible to be on the likes of Kaftrio.
Yeah, so that's a tricky question that the CF community have given a lot of thought to, professional community, and Kaftrio's benefits are very much focused on the CF lungs. People have less exacerbations, produce less sputum, less short of breath, and improve their CF lung function. And of course, after you've had a lung transplant, your lungs are no longer CF lungs. So all of those fantastic benefits that one sees with the lungs if you've got CF have evaporated. Now that's not to say the CF that affects other parts of the body, like your sinuses or your guts or your diabetes, aren't benefited by Kaftrio. In some ways they are. However, there are some cases of people starting Kaftrio, this is from the United States, starting Kaftrio after lung transplantation, and some have reported some benefits, and others have had unexpected declines in lung function, for example, which only got better after stopping Kaftrio. So it's not without its risks. And what the UK CF Medical Association has put out a statement to say is that in people after transplant, for the vast majority of people after transplant, we don't think that Kaftrio is going to offer more benefits than it does risks. So we would recommend against its use. There are a small number of patients where they have what we call really intractable, really difficult, and really untreatable CF complications that are outside the lungs. So, terrible sinuses or really bad bowel problems or uncontrollable diabetes or poor weight gain, for example. And in those situations, we're saying if there really is no other treatment option for that, then if the CF team agree and the transplant team agree and the patient agrees, it might be okay to have a trial of Kaftrio. So that's a long way of sort of saying maybe.
Okay. So I know there's a question about those who are who don't benefit from Kaftrio, and actually I think probably our next question picks this up, hopefully. So what does the future hold for transplants and CF, and how do you think the arrival of modulators therapies has or hasn't changed that, and how does that interact with the people who are not able to take these new medications?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the sort of future of lung transplantation as I see it in a Kaftrio modulator world first, and that's to say that we already have seen a very significant fall in the number of people needing a transplant in the last year or two. Obviously, some of that is COVID as well, but I think that's a smaller factor than Kaftrio. So less people have been needing transplants, but I don't think that Kaftrio is going to be the complete 100% panacea that will prevent everyone from needing a transplant who takes it, and that. But I think it will postpone the need for transplant by many years and maybe even many decades, and maybe some people therefore won't need it at all. But I think the number of people needing a transplant, there will still be a small number of people who will still need a transplant. And then I can see in the chat as well that there is obviously that other subgroup of patients for whom there isn't a modulator therapy yet, and of course they will continue to have a need for transplant in the way that they had beforehand. So there's both the people who don't have access to a modulator, and then a small number of people who have access to a modulator who either can't tolerate it or don't get benefit, or in due course have had benefit but have gradually declined nonetheless and have reached that time when it's when they do need a transplant. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I know there is another question, but for the sake of time, I'll have to move us on, but we will try and pick up any other questions afterwards perhaps and see what we can do to publish some written answers. So thank you so much, Tom. That was fascinating, really interesting, and thank you for joining us. I shall ask you to camera off and mute, and I shall hand over to Jess, who's going to talk about the Cystic Fibrosis Trust's policy work in the area of transplant. So Jess, over to you.
Thanks, Becky, and thanks so much, Tom and Andrea. It's absolutely fascinating. So obviously Tom's just talked about the fact that despite CFTR modulators and their development, that lung transplants are going to remain a necessary reality for a lot of people with CF. And as such, we are developing campaigning work in this area to make sure that as many people with CF as possible can have successful transplants and feel informed and supported whilst waiting for and after receiving a transplant. So we'll be launching some new work on transplant, and the areas I talk about tonight are some of the big areas we're going to be focusing on. Of course, we're not going to be able to cover everything, and if we have to decide, we have to decide which areas are going to deliver most to the community. But rest assured, just because an area isn't the primary focus of our campaign, doesn't mean we're not going to address it in other ways. So for example, our ongoing work includes being a member of the recently convened organ utilisation group, which was set up by the Secretary of State to address issues in the transplant system. And we're also involved in the cardiothoracic transplant patient advisory group, as some of you may well be as post-transplant patients. So whilst we recognise how incredibly important it is that people discuss their donation wishes with their family, and that donations can take place thanks to the kindness of strangers, because without it, we wouldn't have transplants, we do not believe that the lack of sign-ups to the organ donor register is the current limiting factor. NHS Blood and Transplant have agreed with us in their most recent strategy, and they echo our concerns around underutilisation of donated organs and the patchy use of innovative technologies, so like ECMO that Tom touched on. So there are a significant number of donor lungs which are not used for a variety of reasons, which means they're not utilised as they could be. So different points of the organ journey can be a potential stumbling block. There's a long process from an organ being donated to it being ready for transplant into somebody who needs it. After checking the health of the organ and doing all the safety tests, there needs to be a team of surgeons available to retrieve the organ. And then the receiving surgeon needs to look at all the information and decide if that organ is good to transplant and if it suits the patient. Different surgeons at different centres will have differing attitudes to the level of risk they're willing to take when transplanting an organ. They're going to need to consider where that balance of risk lies. Is the organ from an older donor, or is it from somebody who smokes? Does this patient stand a good chance of a good quality of life if this organ is transplanted into them? Or are they unwell enough that they are more likely to die on the list if they don't take whatever organ comes up at this point? Can they afford to continue to wait? They also need to have a transplant team available day and night, and available intensive care beds and theatres, and all of the necessary resources which come with such major surgery. So not having any of these available equates to resource issues. So with just 5 lung transplant centres across the UK, all of which are in England, geography and differing patient populations are going to affect some of their practice. We are concerned, however, about disproportionate inequity within the transplant process. So transplant care is funded and commissioned separately to CF care. And some centres currently rely on charitable funding for access to some innovative technologies. These mean services, access to service ECMO, used as a bridge to transplant for the sickest patients, is not necessarily uniform across all 5 centres. So we have been lobbying to change this, and are happy to welcome a change in commissioning, which should see some improvements in equity soon. Differing referral practices means some CF centres do automatically refer to their nearest lung transplant centre, as Tom said, whereas others do give patients more of a choice of where they want to be referred. And the person who asked about that question may well be in that position where they feel that they have a decision that rests on their shoulders and isn't purely something that's being dictated to them. This can be somewhat of a lottery, as the approach seems to vary so much centre to centre. And that makes it especially difficult if you're not armed with the right information and support. We recognise that some people are going to have to travel far further to reach a transplant centre, and that financial barriers might make this far more difficult for some. Alongside the need for support and the pressure placed on family and friends when travelling further afield, this all adds up to make a difficult situation and makes an already incredibly pressured time even more difficult if we're going to have to consider finances. It's important, if you are in this position, that you are supported to minimise financial stress and be able to make decisions based on the best option for your health. Recognise that transplant can be an expensive process and that personal finances should not be a barrier to your health. So if you're struggling, do make sure, as Becky's already said, that you speak to your hospital social worker or call our helpline, who will be able to advise you. Naturally, and as Andrew's already touched on, people deal with the prospect of transplant in different ways, with some acquiring knowledge early on and others preferring to ignore the idea until they're faced with needing to be listed. Information on success rates and short, medium and long-term survival are available through NHS Blood and Transplant's patient website, which I have put a link to in the chat. But is this something that you feel you will actually look at to inform your decisions? Do you feel like there are significant gaps in the provision of relevant information? Is that some of what you're coming to see us about tonight? And is the information that you have been able to access and that's out there provided in a way which makes sense to you at such a stressful time? And does it help you make a truly informed decision? Really, tonight, we're testing the water with you and want to know what you think should be prioritised from the issues that I've spoken about. We have a poll for you to vote in a minute. It's not binding, but it is going to give us a steer as to what you feel needs addressing and where we should head in terms of transplant campaigning and priorities. We absolutely will be doing an increasing amount of work on transplants and the area for both people pre and post-transplant. So when the poll comes up on the screen, if you could choose which is your top priority and what you'd like to see us tackle, then that would be really useful for us going forward, and we can think about that when deciding on our priorities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jess. And I'll just give people a minute to read through and fill those in. You've got one choice only. Lovely.
If any of them aren't clear or you need a bit more explanation, please put it in the chat and I'm happy to respond to you on that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jess. Okay, so that almost brings us to a close this evening. So we will pick up any other questions as much as we can afterwards. I just want to say a huge thank you to our speakers and also to all of you who've come along and listened today. We're going to pop some links into some reading if you like some reading materials after this. So we have a range of information packs about transplant aimed at both people with CF and also families and carers. So they may be helpful. And the way we develop our information resources is we work very much with people with experience, and they guide us in what we should and shouldn't include, and wherever possible share their stories in our resources. So I hope you'll find them useful. And also you've already had the link to Andrew's blog if you want to read a bit more about his experiences. We're going to pop up a final poll, which is similar to the one we popped up earlier, which is about your knowledge of transplant. So we're now asking you, following the event, how confident you feel to make informed choices about the transplant process. So I'll give you a second to fill that in. If we could share the results of that on the screen, that would be great. Lovely, thank you. Oh, great. Great. Well, I hope people have found this useful and informative. So a few things that I wanted to flag in terms of events that we have coming up. We have a specific event coming up on the 2nd of December in the evening, the wellbeing event for people who are post-transplant. That's called Feeling Safe in Uncertain Times, and really recognises that it has been a tough 18 months for everybody, but it has been really tough for people post-transplant. So we're running, it's a really nice wellbeing session for people to just kind of come together in a safe space and get support to manage feelings of fear and anxiety and stress. And that will be delivered by Tina Clark, who's a somatic movement and yoga facilitator, and she also has CF and is herself 7 years post-transplant. These CF Live events will return in January, where we have a really important event dedicated to focusing on our research priorities. So we're aiming to, this is a big scale project for us to bring together the whole CF community to find out what you hope that research will help in terms of life with CF from 2022 and beyond. So keep an eye on our website and our social media, and we'll be releasing that date, and we'd really welcome you along. And finally, December sees our annual Carols by Candlelight service. We have 2 events running this year. It's now in its 19th year, and there are tickets on sale for an in-person event on 16th of December, and also a virtual premiere on 23rd of December. That brings us to a close. A huge thank you to all our speakers and to everybody who's attended. We will share this as a recording. If you want to look back on anything, we will do our best to pick up any other questions as well. And do keep in touch with us. And as I've said, our helpline will be back open tomorrow if you have particular questions that come out of here that we can help with. Take care, everybody, and thank you for coming.